1. The Man in the Woods. Redditor u/haunted_hiker shared a bone-chilling story from their teenage years, a story that still haunts them to this day. Growing up in a small town nestled near a vast and dense forest, the woods were a place of adventure for them and their friends. However, this forest also had a darker side, filled with local legends of missing persons and unexplained phenomena. One summer, craving solitude and the thrill of the unknown, they decided to embark on a solo hiking trip deep into the woods, far beyond where they had ever ventured before. After several hours of hiking, they found a perfect spot to set up camp, a clearing surrounded by towering trees with a small creek nearby. The tranquility was almost surreal, but as night fell, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. The forest, once full of life and sound, fell eerily silent. In the dead of night, they were abruptly awakened by the sound of rustling leaves. At first, they dismissed it as an animal, but the rustling soon gave way to something far more disturbing, faint whispers, almost like a conversation just out of earshot. Straining to listen, the whispers grew louder, but the words were indistinct, muddled by the dense foliage. Then, amidst the whispers, they heard something that made their blood run cold. Someone, or something, was mimicking their voice, calling out for help. The voice was eerily similar, but there was something off about it, a hollow and unnatural tone that sent shivers down their spine. Paralyzed with fear, they stayed still, listening as the voice continued to call out, echoing through the trees. As dawn approached, the voice faded, replaced by the sound of birds chirping and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. Shaken, they quickly packed up and left the forest, vowing never to return. It wasn't until years later that they learned the forest had a dark history. A man had gone missing there decades ago, his body never found. Some hikers reported hearing his voice long after his disappearance, calling out for help in the dead of night. Whether it was the man's spirit or something else entirely, /haunted_hiker never went back to find out. 2. The Old Woman in the Window. Reddit user u/ghostlyglance recounts a disturbing experience from their childhood that has left a permanent scar on their psyche. They grew up in a small, close-knit town where everyone knew each other, and the community thrived on shared stories and local legends. Across the street from their house stood an abandoned house, a place that had long since fallen into disrepair. The house had a tragic past. A fire had claimed the lives of the family that once lived there, and the town, out of respect and perhaps fear, left the house untouched. As a child, u/ghostlyglance was always warned to stay away from the old house, but like all children, they were curious. One night, unable to sleep, they stared out of their bedroom window, their gaze drawn to the dark silhouette of the house across the street. As they watched, they noticed a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. To their horror, they saw an old woman staring back at them, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark pits that seemed to bore into their soul. Frozen in fear, they watched as the old woman's lips moved, as if whispering something, though no sound reached their ears. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When they finally found the courage to look away and run to their parents, they were met with skepticism. Their parents assured them that the house was empty, and what they saw was just a figment of their imagination. Years later, after they had moved away, u/ghostlyglance heard from a childhood friend that the old house was finally being demolished. But before the wrecking crew could finish their work, several workers reported seeing an old woman in the windows, even though the house had been cleared out. Some say it was the spirit of the mother who perished in the fire, forever watching over her lost home. Others believe it was something far more sinister, something that refused to let go of the past. 3. The shadow figure in the basement. User u/darkcorridors shared a terrifying encounter from their college days, one that would make anyone think twice about venturing into dark, forgotten places. They were living in an old apartment building that had once been a grand hotel during the early 20th century. The building had a rich history, but over the years it had fallen into disrepair, and the once luxurious rooms were now cheap student housing. Despite the creaky floors and outdated decor, the building had a certain charm, except for the basement. The basement was a cold, damp place where tenants stored their belongings. It was filled with old furniture, broken appliances, and the kind of random junk that accumulates in such places. But it was also a place of unease. U/Dark Corridors had heard rumors from other tenants about strange occurrences in the basement, lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and a pervasive sense of being watched. One evening, they'd ventured into the basement to retrieve a box of winter clothes. As they descended the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thick with the smell of mildew. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as they entered the room. As they scanned the rows of boxes and furniture, they felt a sudden wave of unease. Out of the corner of their eye, they saw a shadow figure standing at the far end of the basement. The figure was tall and humanoid, but had no discernible features. It stood perfectly still, yet its presence felt oppressive and malevolent. U/Dark Corridors tried to rationalize what they were seeing, telling themselves it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by some object. But as they stared at it, the figure seemed to shift, almost as if it were aware of being watched. They grabbed their box and hurried back up the stairs, the feeling of dread intensifying with each step. That night, they had a nightmare of the shadow figure standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep. When they reported the incident to the landlord, they were met with a knowing look. The landlord revealed that the building had once housed a mental institution on the lower floors, and many patients had died under mysterious circumstances. Several tenants had reported seeing the shadow figure in the basement, but no one knew what it was or why it lingered. U/Dark Corridors moved out shortly after, but the image of the shadow figure stayed with them, haunting their dreams and making them wary of dark places ever since. 4. The Phantom Knock. Redditor U/Quiet Visitor recounts a night of terror that still makes their skin crawl. They were home alone during a stormy night, a night that seemed perfect for watching a horror movie. The wind howled outside, rain lashed against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Settling into the couch, they tried to distract themselves from the eerie atmosphere by turning on the TV. But just as the movie started, they heard a knock at the door. It was a single loud knock, clear enough to make them jump. Thinking it was the wind, they ignored it and continued watching the movie. But then it happened again, this time louder and more insistent. They paused the movie and went to the door, expecting to see a neighbor, or perhaps an animal seeking shelter. But when they opened the door, there was no one there. Perplexed, they closed the door and returned to the couch, trying to shake off the unease that was beginning to settle in. But the knocking continued, this time coming from a different door. They checked each time, but each time the door was empty. The knocking began to move around the house, coming from the windows, the back door, even the walls. It was as if something was circling the house, trying to find a way in. Panic set in as they realized they were completely alone, with no one to call for help. The house was located in a remote area, with the nearest neighbor miles away. They locked all the doors and windows, but the knocking continued, growing louder and more erratic. It was as if whatever was outside was becoming more desperate. The knocking persisted throughout the night, only stopping just before dawn. Exhausted and terrified, they stayed awake until the sun finally rose, bringing a sense of safety. But the experience left them deeply shaken. They later learned that the area where their house was built had once been a settlement during the early colonial days. Legend had it that a group of settlers had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. Some locals believed their spirits still wandered the area, knocking on doors in a futile attempt to find shelter. U/Quiet Visitor moved out of the house shortly after, unable to live with the constant fear of that night repeating itself. To this day, they can't hear a knock at the door without feeling a surge of anxiety, wondering if it's really a visitor or something far more sinister. 5. The Unseen Stalker. User U/CreepItOutFollower shared a harrowing experience from when they worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. It was a job they took to help pay for college, but the night shift was often lonely and unsettling. The diner was located on the outskirts of town, with few customers during the late hours. Most nights were quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional clatter of dishes breaking the silence. One night, a man came in around 3 a.m. He was tall, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that gave him a haunting appearance. He sat at the counter, ordering only coffee. From the moment he walked in, U/CreepItOutFollower felt a wave of discomfort. The man didn't speak, didn't smile. He simply stared at them the entire time, his eyes never leaving their face. As the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The man stayed for hours, sipping his coffee and continuing to stare. Finally, just before dawn, he left without a word, leaving a few crumpled bills on the counter. U/Creep-It-Out follower was relieved to see him go, but the sense of dread didn't leave with him. In fact, it only got worse. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. U/Creep-It-Out follower would hear footsteps behind them while working, even when the diner was empty. Objects would be moved or knocked over when no one was around. The final straw came when they started finding notes on their car windshield after their shift. The notes contained messages like, "I see you, and you can't hide." Terrified, they reported the incidents to the police, but there was little they could do without any evidence. The harassment continued, with the notes becoming more frequent and more threatening. Fearing for their safety, U/Creep-It-Out follower quit their job and moved to another city, hoping to leave the terror behind. But even after moving, the feeling of being watched never completely went away. They often caught themselves looking over their shoulder, half expecting to see the gaunt man from the diner standing there. To this day, they live with the fear that the unseen stalker might find them again, lurking in the shadows, waiting to make his next move. 6. The creepy cabin in the woods. Reddit user U/NightmareGetaway shares a tale of a weekend trip that quickly turned into a nightmare. They and a group of friends decided to rent a remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The cabin was located deep in the forest, far from any civilization, a perfect spot for some peace and relaxation. Or so they thought. The first day was uneventful, filled with hiking and enjoying the natural beauty of the forest. But as night fell, things began to take a darker turn. As they sat around the campfire, they started hearing strange noises coming from the woods, whispers, rustling leaves, and what sounded like distant footsteps. They brushed it off as animals or the wind, but the unease lingered. That night, as they settled into the cabin, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors that had been securely locked were found open, and objects in the cabin were moved or knocked over without explanation. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense, with everyone feeling like they were being watched. The final straw came the next morning when they discovered footprints in the mud around the cabin. The footprints were large and human-like, but were spaced too far apart to be from any of them. More disturbingly, the footprints seemed to circle the cabin, leading up to the windows and the front door, but there were no tracks leading away. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone in the woods. They quickly packed up and decided to leave immediately. As they drove away, one of the friends glanced back at the cabin and screamed. In the window, they saw a figure, tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes, standing in the cabin, watching them leave. They never spoke about the incident again, but the memory of that weekend haunted them all. To this day, U/NightmareGetaway refuses to go camping or stay in any remote location, fearing they might encounter whatever it was that lurked in the woods that night. 7. The Haunted Hotel. User U/Wandering Nomad shared a story from their travels, a story that made them rethink their love for exploring old historic places. They were staying in a historic hotel known for its beautiful architecture and rich history. The hotel was a favorite among tourists, not only for its charm, but also for its reputation as one of the most haunted places in the region. On the first night of their stay, they were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of someone breathing heavily in the room. Startled, they turned on the lights, but the room was empty. Shaking it off as a vivid dream, they went back to sleep, only to be awakened again, this time by the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside their door. They opened the door to find the hallway empty. The footsteps stopped the moment they stepped out, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The next day, they spoke to the hotel staff, who casually mentioned that many guests reported similar experiences, particularly in the room U/Wandering Nomad was staying in. Intrigued but unsettled, they decided to stay another night. That evening, they explored the hotel, taking in the old portraits on the walls, the antique furniture, and the dimly lit corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. As they returned to their room, they felt a sudden chill in the air, and a heavy feeling of dread washed over them. That night, the experiences grew more intense. They were awakened by the sound of whispers in the room, though they were alone. The whispers were indistinct, like a conversation happening just beyond the edge of hearing. Then, they felt a cold breath on the back of their neck, as if someone was standing right behind them. Terrified, they checked out the next morning, unable to spend another night in the hotel. As they were leaving, one of the staff members mentioned that the room they had stayed in was rumored to be haunted by a former guest who had died there under mysterious circumstances. The guest, a young woman, was said to wander the halls at night, searching for something or someone she had lost. Wandering nomad left the hotel, but the experience left them deeply unsettled. They still enjoy traveling, but they now avoid any place with a reputation for being haunted, unable to forget the feeling of being watched in that dark, old hotel. 8. The face in the mirror. Redditor u/Frozen in Place shared an experience that left them terrified of mirrors for years. It all started during a sleepover at a friend's house, a house that was known among their group for being a bit strange. The house was old, with creaky floors, dim lighting, and a general sense of unease that seemed to permeate every room. But as kids, they didn't think much of it until that night. After a fun evening of games and movies, u/Frozen in Place went to the bathroom to wash up before bed. The bathroom was small and cold, with an old mirror above the sink that looked like it had been there for decades. As they washed their hands, they glanced up at the mirror and froze in place. Staring back at them was a face that wasn't their own. The face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes and a sinister smile that sent chills down their spine. They turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind them, but the bathroom was empty. The face in the mirror remained, its eyes locked onto theirs, the smile growing wider as if it knew the terror it was causing. In a panic, they ran out of the bathroom and refused to go back in. The friend's parents dismissed it as a nightmare, but u/Frozen in Place knew what they had seen. The next day, they told their friend about the face in the mirror. To their surprise, the friend didn't seem shocked. Instead, they admitted that others had seen the same face in that bathroom mirror, and it had been a topic of discussion among their family for years. The friend's family believed the house was haunted, but they had learned to live with it, brushing off the strange occurrences as part of the house's charm. But for u/Frozen in Place, the experience was far from charming, it was horrifying. To this day, they avoid mirrors at night, fearful of what they might see staring back at them. 9. The Call from the Other Side. User u/Final Call shared a chilling story about receiving a phone call that should have been impossible. It happened shortly after their grandfather passed away, a man they were very close to. His death had been sudden, and u/Final Call was struggling to cope with the loss. Late one night, as they were lying in bed, their phone rang. They groggily picked it up, expecting it to be a wrong number. But when they looked at the screen, their hearts skipped a beat. It was their grandfather's number. Thinking it was some kind of glitch, they hesitated before answering. When they finally did, they were met with a moment of silence, followed by the familiar voice of their grandfather. His voice was calm and steady, as it always had been, but there was an urgency in his words that they had never heard before. "Be careful," he said. "I'm watching over you, but you need to be careful." Before they could respond, the line went dead. u/Final Call sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to their ear. The number that had called was no longer in service. It couldn't have been real. But the voice had been unmistakable. Shaken, they tried to convince themselves it was a dream, a figment of their imagination brought on by grief. The next day, they went about their routine, trying to forget the strange call. But later that afternoon, they had a near miss with a car that ran a red light. The car missed them by mere inches, and they couldn't shake the feeling that the call had been a warning, somehow protecting them from harm. The experience left u/Final Call deeply unsettled. They couldn't explain how or why it happened, but they believed their grandfather had found a way to reach out from the other side, offering a final act of protection. The event made them question everything they thought they knew about life and death, leaving them with more questions than answers. 10. The Disappearing Child. Reddit user u/LostChild recounts a disturbing encounter that defies explanation. While out for a walk in a local park, they saw a little girl playing alone near a grove of trees. The girl, who looked no older than 6 or 7, was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, the kind you might see in photos from the early 1900s. Concerned that the child was alone, u/LostChild approached her and asked where her parents were. The girl didn't seem frightened or lost. Instead, she smiled and pointed to the woods, saying her parents were waiting for her. Lost child turned to look in the direction the girl was pointing, but all they saw were the dense, dark trees. When they turned back to ask the girl more questions, she was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic set in as they searched the area, calling out for the girl, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Frantically, they called the police, reporting what had happened. A search was conducted, but no child matching the girl's description was found. The police seemed skeptical, hinting that maybe Lost child had seen something that wasn't really there. Days later, still haunted by the encounter, Lost child mentioned it to a local historian who was well versed in the town's history. The historian's face grew pale as they listened, then told Lost child about a tragic event that had occurred in the park many years ago. A young girl had gone missing there, her body never found. The girl was last seen playing near the same grove of trees where Lost child had seen the child. Locals believe the girl's spirit still lingered in the park, searching for her parents who never came for her. Lost child was left with a profound sense of unease, knowing they had encountered something that defied logic and reason, a lost soul, trapped between worlds, still seeking a reunion that would never come. 11. The figure in the rearview mirror. Redditor Haunted Driver recounts a terrifying late-night drive that changed the way they viewed the world around them. It was a long, winding road through a heavily wooded area, with no streetlights to guide the way. The night was pitch black, and the only sound was the low hum of the engine as they made their way home from a late shift. They had driven this route many times before, but that night something felt different. A palpable sense of unease hung in the air. As they rounded a particularly sharp curve, their headlights briefly illuminated something in the road, a figure standing still in the middle of the lane. They slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but as they squinted through the windshield, the figure was gone. Shaking it off as a trick of the light or perhaps a deer, they continued on, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing mile. A few minutes later, they glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Sitting in the backseat, just barely visible in the dim light, was the figure they had seen on the road. It was a man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes staring directly at them. His expression was one of anger, or perhaps sorrow, and his mouth moved as if he was whispering something, though no sound reached their ears. Panic set in, and they instinctively jerked the steering wheel, causing the car to swerve. When they looked back in the mirror, the figure was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur, with Haunted Driver barely able to focus on the road, their mind racing with fear and confusion. They arrived home, shaken but unharmed, and locked every door and window in the house, still feeling the lingering presence of the man in the mirror. The experience haunted them for weeks. They'd avoided driving at night and refused to take that particular road again. Eventually, they confided in a coworker who had lived in the area for years. The coworker paled as they listened and revealed that there had been a tragic accident on that road many years ago. A man had died in a car crash on that very curve, and since then, there had been multiple reports of drivers seeing him in their rearview mirrors, especially on nights when the fog was thick and the moon was new. To this day, Haunted Driver can't shake the memory of that night and the figure that appeared in their rearview mirror. They still avoid driving alone at night, haunted by the thought that the man could appear again, seeking something or someone he had lost on that dark, lonely road. 12. The doll that moved. Reddit user u/Coaster Toy shares a childhood memory that has left them with a lifelong fear of dolls. Growing up, they had a large collection of dolls, a gift from their grandmother who loved to sew tiny outfits for them. Among the collection was one doll that always stood out, a Victorian-era porcelain doll, with dark, curly hair, a delicate lace dress, and piercing blue eyes that seemed almost too real. The doll was a family heirloom, passed down through generations, and was always treated with great care. One night, after tucking the dolls into their shelf, u/Cursor Toy went to bed. They awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft shuffling. Groggy and disoriented, they looked around the room but saw nothing out of place. Assuming it was just a dream, they turned over and tried to go back to sleep. But as they closed their eyes, they heard the shuffling again, this time accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible giggle. Fear gripped them as they slowly turned their head towards the shelf where the dolls were kept. To their horror, the Victorian doll was no longer in its place. Instead, it was standing on the floor, closer to the bed, its glassy blue eyes staring directly at them. Paralyzed with fear, they couldn't move or scream, only stare in shock as the doll seemed to inch closer, its smile wide and unsettling. They'd finally mustered the courage to jump out of bed and run to their parents' room, waking them in a panic. Their parents dismissed the incident as a nightmare and gently placed the doll back on the shelf, but U/Cursed knew what they had seen. The next morning, they found the doll in the same place on the floor, its eyes still locked in that eerie, lifelike gaze. Convinced that the doll was somehow cursed, they'd begged their parents to get rid of it. But their grandmother insisted that it was a treasured family heirloom and refused to part with it. As the years went on, U/Cursed had more unsettling experiences with the doll, finding it in different places, hearing faint whispers when they were alone in their room, and always feeling like they were being watched. It wasn't until they were much older that they learned the true history of the doll. It had originally belonged to a distant relative who had died under mysterious circumstances. The relative had been obsessed with doll, believing it was possessed by the spirit of her deceased daughter. 13. The Ghost in the Attic. User U/Hidden Visitor recounts the story of their childhood home, a large old Victorian house with an attic that was always locked. The house had been in the family for generations, and while it was full of charm and history, it also had its share of secrets. The attic was one of them. From the time they were young, U/Hidden Visitor was told never to go into the attic. It was off limits, a rule that was never explained but strictly enforced. As they grew older, their curiosity about the attic only increased. Why was it always locked? What was up there that their parents didn't want them to see? They asked their parents repeatedly, but their questions were always met with vague answers or a stern warning to stay away. The mystery of the attic became an obsession, especially after they started hearing strange noises coming from above their room at night. The noises were subtle at first, soft thumps, creaks, and the sound of something scraping against the floor. But as time went on, the noises became more pronounced, like the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. On particularly stormy nights, they even heard what sounded like faint crying coming from the attic. Their parents insisted it was just the house settling, but U/Hidden Visitor wasn't convinced. One day, when their parents were out, they decided to investigate. They'd found the attic key hidden in a drawer and made their way up the narrow staircase. The door creaked ominously as they unlocked it, revealing a dusty, dimly lit space filled with old furniture, boxes, and family heirlooms. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small, dirty window at the far end of the attic. As they explored the space, they noticed something strange. A small, child-sized chair placed in the center of the room, facing the window. On the chair was a faded photograph of a young girl, no older than 5, dressed in an old-fashioned dress. The girl's face was expressionless, her eyes hauntingly sad. Next to the chair was a small wooden dollhouse, intricately detailed and eerily similar to their own home. As they picked up the photograph, they heard a soft rustling behind them. They turned around to see the figure of a young girl, translucent and glowing, standing by the window. The girl looked at them with the same sad eyes from the photograph, then slowly raised her hand, pointing to the dollhouse. U/Hidden Visitor felt a wave of cold wash over them as the girl's form began to fade, leaving only the echo of her presence in the still air. Terrified, they ran out of the attic, locking the door behind them. When their parents returned, they told them what had happened. Their parents exchanged worried glances and finally revealed the truth. The girl in the photograph was their great-aunt, who had died tragically in the house many years ago. She had been playing in the attic when a beam collapsed, trapping her inside. By the time she was found, it was too late. The attic had been locked ever since, as a way to keep her restless spirit contained. U/Hidden Visitor never went back into the attic, but the experience left them deeply shaken. They often heard the girl's footsteps at night, pacing back and forth, and the soft sound of her crying when the wind howled through the trees. The family eventually moved out of the house, but the memory of the attic, and the girl who still haunted it, remained with them, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had occurred so many years ago. 14. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Redditor U/Nightly Driver shared a chilling encounter that still makes them question the nature of reality. It was a cold, rainy night, and they were driving home on a deserted stretch of highway. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it difficult to see the road ahead. As they drove, they noticed a figure standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering, with their thumb outstretched. Feeling a pang of sympathy, they pulled over and offered the hitchhiker a ride. The hitchhiker was a young woman with long dark hair and pale skin, wearing a thin dress that seemed completely inappropriate for the weather. She thanked them and got into the car, her voice soft and weak, as if she were exhausted. U/Nightly driver asked where she was headed, and she gave them an address a few miles down the road. As they drove, they tried to make conversation, but the woman remained mostly silent, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. When they glanced over at her, they noticed something unsettling. Her clothes didn't seem wet, despite the heavy rain, and there was a faint cold mist surrounding her, almost as if she were emitting a chill. When they reached the address she had given, U/Nightly driver turned to tell her they had arrived, but the back seat was empty. The woman had vanished without a trace. Stunned, they got out of the car and knocked on the door of the house, hoping to find some explanation. 15. The poltergeist in the office. User U/Haunted Workplace shared an unsettling experience from their time working in an old historical office building. The building was located in the heart of downtown, with a rich history dating back to the early 1900s. Over the years, it had been used for various purposes, from a hotel to a bank, and now as office space. Despite its modern renovations, the building retained a sense of its past, with creaky floors, high ceilings, and an unsettling atmosphere. U/Haunted Workplace often worked late, sometimes being the last person in the office. On several occasions, they noticed strange things happening. Objects would be moved or knocked over, lights would flicker, and they would hear strange noises, like footsteps and muffled voices, even when they were completely alone. At first, they'd brushed it off as the building settling or the air conditioning kicking on, but the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, while working late on a particularly stressful project, they heard a loud bang from the conference room down the hall. Thinking someone might still be in the building, they went to check it out, but the room was empty. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, seemingly on its own. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it closed. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped in the room. They banged on the door, calling out for help, but there was no response. The air in the room grew cold, and they felt a sudden pressure on their chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if something was pressing down on them, trying to suffocate them. Just as they were about to pass out, the pressure lifted, and the door swung open. U/Haunted Workplace stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, and immediately grabbed their things and left the building, not caring if they left anything behind. The next day, they tried to rationalize what had happened, but the fear remained. When they mentioned the incident to a coworker, they were met with a knowing look. The coworker revealed that the building was rumored to be haunted by the spirit of a former bank employee who had died under mysterious circumstances. The employee had been working late one night when the bank was robbed. In the chaos, the employee was killed, and some believed his spirit still lingered in the building, angry and restless. U/Haunted Workplace eventually left the job, unable to shake the feeling of dread that hung over them every time they entered the office. They still have nightmares about that night, waking up in a cold sweat, the memory of the poltergeist in the conference room etched into their mind forever. 16. The Whispering Closet. Redditor U/Shrouded Voices recounts a childhood experience that left them terrified of closets for years. Growing up in a small house in the suburbs, U/Shrouded Voices shared a bedroom with their younger sibling. The room was cozy but had one feature that always unsettled them, a large old-fashioned closet that took up nearly an entire wall. The closet had heavy wooden doors with ornate carvings, and it always seemed to be a bit too dark inside, even in the daytime. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, U/Shrouded Voices began hearing strange noises coming from the closet, soft whispers that seemed to echo in the darkness. At first, they thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but as the nights went on, the whispers became more distinct, as if multiple voices were having a conversation just out of earshot. One night, curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, they crept out of bed and slowly opened the closet door. The light revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just clothes, shoes, and a few old toys. But as they shined the flashlight deeper into the closet, the whispers grew louder, and they could feel a cold draft emanating from somewhere within. Suddenly, the closet door slammed shut on its own, plunging them into darkness. They'd fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew more frantic, as if the voices were agitated by their presence. Terrified, they'd banged on the door, screaming for help. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally swung open, and they tumbled out, gasping for air. Their parents, awakened by the commotion, rushed into the room and found them in tears. They tried to explain what had happened, but their parents dismissed it as a nightmare. However, shrouded voices knew what they had experienced was real. The whispers, the cold draft, the door slamming shut, it was all too vivid to be a dream. For years, they avoided the closet, never daring to open it at night. It wasn't until they were older that they learned the truth about the house. The previous owner had been a recluse, known in the neighborhood for practicing dark rituals. 17. The room that disappeared. User /Lost in Space shared an experience from their time exploring an abandoned building with friends. The building was an old asylum, long since closed down and left to decay. It had become a popular spot for urban explorers, drawn to its eerie atmosphere and the stories of hauntings that surrounded it. Despite the warnings and the rumors, /Lost in Space and their friends decided to explore it one night, eager to see if the stories were true. As they wandered through the dark, crumbling halls, they found themselves in a section of the building that seemed untouched by time. The walls were still intact, and the doors were closed, as if the patients and staff had just left. They came across a door that was slightly ajar, and without thinking, /Lost in Space pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, with only a bed and a chair, both covered in dust. But as they looked around, they noticed something strange. The room seemed to be shifting, as if the walls were moving in on them. The air grew thick, and they felt a sense of vertigo, as if they were being pulled into another dimension. They tried to leave, but the door was no longer where it had been. Instead, they were surrounded by solid walls, with no exit in sight. Panic set in as they realized the room was disappearing, leaving them trapped in an ever-shrinking space. They screamed for help, but their friends just outside couldn't hear them. It was as if they had been cut off from the rest of the world, lost in a space that shouldn't exist. Just when they thought they would be crushed by the closing walls, the room suddenly returned to normal. The door reappeared, and they stumbled out, gasping for air. Their friends were confused, having heard nothing and seen nothing unusual. But /Lost in Space knew what they had experienced was real. The room had trapped them, pulling them into a place that existed outside of time and space. They left the building immediately, shaken by the experience. It wasn't until they researched the asylum's history that they learned about the experiments conducted on the patients, experiments that involved sensory deprivation and reality manipulation. Some believed the asylum had been built on a dimensional rift, a place where the fabric of reality was thin and could easily tear, trapping anyone who ventured too far. /Lost in Space has never returned to that building, and they warn others to stay away, fearing that the next person who enters that room might not be as lucky. 18. The cabin that wasn't there. Redditor /Wanderingman shares a story of a camping trip that took a turn for the terrifying. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. They had found a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from any roads or trails, and set up camp. The first day was uneventful, filled with hiking and enjoying the serenity of nature. As night fell, they built a fire and settled in for the evening. But as they sat around the fire, they noticed something strange, a cabin in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It hadn't been there earlier, and there were no signs of a trail leading to it. Curious, they decided to investigate. The cabin was old and weathered, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door creaked open as they approached, revealing a dark, empty interior. The air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been for that time of year. As they stepped inside, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room plunged into darkness. They fumbled for their flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The only light came from the small, dirty windows, barely illuminating the room. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they saw something that made their blood run cold, shadows moving along the walls, forming shapes that resembled people, but with distorted, elongated features. The shadows began to close in on them, reaching out with long twisted fingers. Panic set in, and they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows were almost upon them when the door suddenly flew open, and they tumbled out into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached their campsite, gasping for breath and covered in cold sweat. They packed up their things and left immediately, but as they looked back, the cabin was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. The next day, they returned to the spot with friends, but there was no trace of the cabin. The area where it had stood was just empty forest, with no sign of any structure. The experience left you/wandering men questioning what they had seen. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind? Or had they stumbled upon something far more sinister, an apparition of a place that once existed, trapped in a time loop, reappearing to lure in unsuspecting victims? 19. The Haunted Hospital Ward. User U/Forgotten Room shared a story from their time working as a night nurse in an old hospital. The hospital had been around for decades, and while most of the building had been renovated, there was one ward that remained mostly unchanged, Ward 13. The ward was rarely used, only opened when the hospital was at full capacity, and even then, the staff tried to avoid it. The ward had a dark history, with numerous reports of paranormal activity over the years. One night, the hospital was unusually busy, and U/Forgotten Room was assigned to Ward 13. The moment they stepped onto the ward, they felt a chill in the air, despite the heating being on. The lights flickered as they made their rounds, and they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The patients, too, seemed uneasy, with some reporting strange noises and shadows in their rooms. As the night wore on, things only got worse. One patient began screaming that someone was in their room, standing at the foot of the bed. But when U/Forgotten Room checked, the room was empty. Another patient claimed to see figures walking down the hall, only to vanish when approached. The most unsettling moment came when U/Forgotten Room entered one of the empty rooms and found the bed sheets neatly folded, as if waiting for a new patient, despite the room having been unoccupied for weeks. But the worst was yet to come. Around 3 a.m., the lights in the ward went out completely, plunging the entire floor into darkness. As they fumbled for a flashlight, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. The footsteps stopped just outside the nurse's station, but when they shined the flashlight into the hall, no one was there. The power returned a few moments later, but the atmosphere in the ward had changed. The patients were restless, whispering about the shadowy figures they had seen. One of the patients, an elderly woman, took U/Forgotten Room's hand and said, "They don't want us here. They're angry." The night dragged on, and by the time morning came, U/Forgotten Room was exhausted and unnerved. They spoke to a senior nurse about what had happened, and the nurse sighed, saying, "Ward 13 is cursed. It was once the site of a mass tragedy. A fire broke out years ago, killing several patients who were trapped inside. Some believe their spirits still haunt the ward, reliving their final moments." After that night, U/Forgotten Room requested to never be assigned to Ward 13 again. The memory of that night, of the shadows, the footsteps, and the oppressive feeling of being watched, stayed with them, a constant reminder of the dark history that lingered within the walls of the hospital. 20. The House on the Hill. Redditor U/Neverturn shares a story about a house that had a reputation for being haunted. The house sat alone on a hill, overlooking a small town. It had been abandoned for years, with broken windows, peeling paint, and a roof that looked ready to cave in. Despite its state of disrepair, the house had a strange allure, drawing in thrill seekers and ghost hunters from all over. One summer, U/Neverturn and a group of friends decided to explore the house. They had heard the stories, how the house was once home to a family who had all mysteriously died within a week of each other, how their bodies were never properly buried, and how their spirits were said to still roam the halls. But they didn't believe in ghosts and thought it would be a fun adventure. They arrived at the house just before sunset, the long shadows stretching out over the overgrown yard. As they approached the front door, they felt a sudden drop in temperature, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. Undeterred, They pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was worse than they had imagined, dusty, dark, and filled with old, rotting furniture. The walls were covered in strange symbols that looked like they had been scratched into the wood. As they explored the house, they began to hear odd noises, whispers, creaking floorboards, and the faint sound of crying. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, they found an old portrait of the family that had lived there. The faces were faded, but the eyes seemed to follow them as they moved around the room. One of the friends, feeling brave, decided to take the portrait as a souvenir. But as they lifted it off the wall, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were also stuck, and the whispers grew louder, now clearly coming from all around them. It was as if the house itself was alive, trapping them inside. Suddenly, the portrait fell from the friend's hands and shattered on the floor, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall behind it. Inside the compartment was a small, black book, its pages filled with disturbing drawings and cryptic writing. 21. The Crying Baby in the Walls. Redditor Hidden Whales shared a terrifying experience that occurred after they moved into an old fixer-upper house in a quiet neighborhood. The house was charming but needed a lot of work, and they were excited to make it their own. However, from the first night they moved in, they began to hear something deeply unsettling, the sound of a baby crying. The cries were faint at first, barely noticeable, but they seemed to be coming from inside the walls. At first, they thought it might be an animal trapped in the walls, perhaps a cat or a raccoon. But the sound was too distinct, too human. It didn't help that the cries always seemed to happen at the same time every night, around 3 a.m. They called in a pest control expert who inspected the house thoroughly but found nothing, no nests, no signs of animals, nothing that could explain the noise. The crying continued, growing louder and more desperate. It seemed to move through the house, coming from different walls on different nights. The most terrifying part was that the cries sometimes seemed to be right next to their bed, as if the baby was trapped just inches away. Desperate for answers, they began researching the history of the house. What they discovered was horrifying. The house had once belonged to a family who had suffered a terrible tragedy. The mother, suffering from severe postpartum depression, had taken her own life after losing her infant to illness. The baby had died in its crib, and the mother, overcome with grief, had hidden the body inside the walls of the house before ending her life. The knowledge of what had happened only made the cries more unbearable. They couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and the once charming house now felt like a prison. They'd brought in a medium who confirmed their worst fears. The spirit of the baby was still trapped in the house, unable to move on because of the horrific circumstances of its death. The medium performed a ritual to help the spirit find peace, and after that night, the crying stopped. But the experience left Hidden Whales and their family deeply traumatized. They sold the house shortly after and moved far away, but the memory of those cries, so full of pain and despair, has never left them. 22. The Phantom Handprint. Reddit user /HauntingTouch recounts a chilling experience that has left them questioning the nature of reality. They had recently moved into a new apartment, a modern building with no history of strange occurrences or paranormal activity, at least that's what they thought. The first few weeks were uneventful, but then things started to change. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they noticed something strange on their bathroom mirror, a handprint, small and delicate, as if left by a child. The print was perfectly clear, with tiny fingers splayed out, but there was no logical explanation for it. They lived alone, and there hadn't been any visitors, let alone any children, in their apartment. Confused, they wiped the handprint away and went to bed, trying to brush it off as their imagination. But the next morning, the handprint was back, exactly in the same spot. They felt a chill run down their spine as they realized that something was very wrong. Over the next few days, the handprint would appear and disappear at random, sometimes on the mirror, sometimes on the windows, even on the kitchen counter. They tried everything, cleaning the surfaces with bleach, leaving the lights on at night, even burning sage, but nothing worked. The handprint always returned, as if to remind them that they were not alone. Desperate for answers, they started researching the building's history and discovered that a young girl had died in the apartment years before. The circumstances were unclear, but it was rumored that she had been left alone for days before anyone found her. The handprint matched the size of a child's hand, and they began to suspect that the girl's spirit was still lingering, trying to make contact. One night, as they lay in bed, they felt a cold touch on their cheek, like the hand of a child. When they opened their eyes, they saw the faint outline of a small figure standing at the foot of their bed. The figure slowly faded, but the sense of sadness and loneliness lingered in the room. Unable to bear the constant presence, haunting touch eventually moved out of the apartment, but the experience left them with a deep sense of unease, as if the girl's spirit had followed them. To this day, they sometimes wake up with the feeling of a cold hand on their skin, a chilling reminder of the phantom handprint that refused to be erased. 23. The Man in the Hat. User U/Shadow Watcher shares a story about a recurring figure that appeared in their life, a shadowy man who seemed to follow them wherever they went. The first time they saw him was in their childhood home. They had been playing in the backyard when they noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. They ran inside to tell their parents, but when they returned, the man was gone. Their parents assured them it was just a neighbor or a trick of the light, but U/Shadow Watcher knew better. The man felt wrong, like he didn't belong in this world. Over the years, the figure appeared again and again, always at a distance, always watching. Sometimes they would see him standing at the end of the street, other times in the reflection of a window. He never came closer, never interacted with them, but his presence was always unsettling. The most terrifying encounter happened when U/Shadow Watcher was in college. They were living in a dorm, and one night they woke up to a strange feeling, as if someone was in the room with them. When they turned over, they saw the shadowy figure standing at the foot of their bed, his hat casting a long shadow over his face. Paralyzed with fear, they couldn't move or scream, just lay there, staring at the man who had haunted their dreams for so long. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded, leaving the room in darkness. They never saw him again after that night, but the memory of the man in the hat has stayed with them, a lingering fear that he might return. U/Shadow Watcher later learned that many people have reported seeing similar figures, shadowy men in hats, often referred to as shadow people or the Hat Man. These entities are said to be harbingers of doom, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Whether the man in the hat was a figment of their imagination or something far more sinister, they can't say for sure. But the fear of seeing that shadowy figure again is something they live with every day. 24. The Time Loop. Redditor U/Eternaloop shares an experience that defies explanation, a nightmarish event that has left them questioning the very nature of time. It happened during a weekend trip with friends to a cabin in the mountains. The cabin was in a remote location, with no cell service and no nearby towns, the perfect place to disconnect and relax. On the second day, they decided to go for a hike, following a trail that led deep into the forest. The day was beautiful, the weather perfect, and they enjoyed the peace and quiet of nature. But as they reached a clearing, something strange happened. The world around them seemed to shift, as if they had stepped into a different reality. The light changed, the colors grew muted, and the sounds of the forest faded away. Suddenly, they were no longer in the clearing, but back at the start of the trail, as if they had never left. Confused, they checked their watches and realized that no time had passed, even though they had been hiking for hours. Determined to figure out what had happened, they started the hike again, but the same thing happened. They reached the clearing, the world shifted, and they were back at the beginning of the trail. This time, they felt a sense of dread, as if something was preventing them from leaving the trail. They tried again and again, but each time they ended up back at the start, no closer to reaching the cabin. As the sun began to set, the fear grew, and they realized they might be trapped in a time loop, doomed to repeat the same hike over and over. Finally, after what felt like the 100th attempt, they reached the clearing, but this time the world didn't shift. They were able to continue, finally making their way back to the cabin. Exhausted and terrified, they didn't speak of what had happened, but the experience left them deeply shaken. U/Eternaloop later researched time loops and discovered that they are a phenomenon often reported in areas with high levels of magnetic activity or other anomalies. Some believe they are caused by disturbances in the fabric of time and space, while others think they are linked to paranormal activity. Whatever the cause, the experience has left you /eternal loop, questioning the nature of reality and the possibility that time is not as linear as we believe. 25. The forest that changes. User U/Forgotten Path shares a story about a strange and terrifying experience in a forest that seemed to change every time they entered it. The forest was near their childhood home, a place they had explored many times as a kid. But as they grew older, they began to notice something odd. The forest never seemed the same twice. One day, the path would be wide and well-trodden, leading to a familiar clearing. The next, the path would be narrow, overgrown, and lead to a place they had never seen before. Sometimes, the trees seemed to move, their trunks twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they became, as if the forest was shifting around them. The most terrifying experience happened when they were 16. They had gone for a hike with a friend, planning to visit a favorite spot near a stream. But as they walked, the forest began to change. Trees they had never seen before appeared, and the familiar landmarks vanished. They tried to turn back, but the path was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. Panic set in as they realized they were lost in a forest that shouldn't exist. The air grew thick and heavy, and they began to hear strange noises, whispers, rustling leaves, and the distant sound of footsteps. They called out for help, but their voices seemed to be swallowed by the trees. After hours of wandering, they stumbled upon a clearing that neither of them recognized. In the center of the clearing was an old stone circle, overgrown with moss and ivy. The stones were ancient, worn smooth by time, and arranged in a pattern that seemed to have some dark significance. As they approached the circle, the air grew colder, and they felt a presence watching them. Suddenly, the trees around the clearing began to close in, their branches reaching out like arms. Terrified, they ran, pushing through the dense underbrush until they finally broke free and found themselves back on the familiar path. They never spoke of the incident again, but the memory of that day haunted them both. U/Forgotten Path later learned that the forest had a reputation for being unpredictable, with many stories of people getting lost or finding themselves in places that didn't seem to belong. Some believed the forest was alive, constantly changing and shifting to confuse and trap those who entered it. To this day, they avoid the forest, fearing that if they enter it again, they might not be so lucky. The memory of the stone circle and the shifting trees is a constant reminder that some places are best left unexplored, where the rules of reality don't always apply. 26. The Uninvited Guest. Redditor U/Unseen Visitor recounts a terrifying experience during a family gathering that left them questioning the nature of spirits. It was a summer evening, and the whole family had gathered at their grandparents' house for a barbecue. The evening was filled with laughter, good food, and stories shared around the fire. As the night wore on, someone suggested taking a family photo in the backyard. They all gathered around, squeezing together on the porch while one of the cousins set up a camera on a tripod. The camera had a timer, and as they all smiled and waited for the flash, something strange happened. A cold breeze swept through the group despite the warm night. The photo was taken, and they all returned to the fire, not thinking much of the breeze. But when they looked at the photo later, they noticed something that sent a chill down their spines. Standing in the back row among the family was a figure that no one recognized. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark clothes and a pale face. His expression was blank, and his eyes seemed to be staring directly at the camera. Everyone was certain that no one else had been in the yard when the photo was taken. They checked with all the neighbors and friends who might have stopped by, but no one matched the description of the man in the photo. The figure was also slightly transparent, as if he were fading in and out of the picture. Disturbed by the image, they showed it to a family friend who was sensitive to spirits. The friend immediately recognized the figure as a spirit, likely a former resident of the house or someone who had a connection to the land. They suggested that the man had been drawn to the gathering, perhaps curious or lonely, wanting to be a part of the family's joy. The family held a small ceremony to acknowledge the presence and to ask the spirit to move on, and after that night, there were no more strange occurrences. But the photo remains as evidence of the uninvited guest who appeared that evening, a reminder that sometimes the dead are closer than we think. 1. The Man in the Woods. Redditor U/haunted_hiker shared a bone-chilling story from their teenage years, a story that still haunts them to this day. Growing up in a small town nestled near a vast and dense forest, the woods were a place of adventure for them and their friends. However, this forest also had a darker side, filled with local legends of missing persons and unexplained phenomena. One summer, craving solitude and the thrill of the unknown, they decided to embark on a solo hiking trip deep into the woods, far beyond where they had ever ventured before. After several hours of hiking, they found a perfect spot to set up camp, a clearing surrounded by towering trees with a small creek nearby. The tranquility was almost surreal, but as night fell, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. The forest, once full of life and sound, fell eerily silent. In the dead of night, they were abruptly awakened by the sound of rustling leaves. At first, they dismissed it as an animal, but the rustling soon gave way to something far more disturbing, faint whispers, almost like a conversation just out of earshot. Straining to listen, the whispers grew louder, but the words were indistinct, muddled by the dense foliage. Then, amidst the whispers, they heard something that made their blood run cold. Someone, or something, was mimicking their voice, calling out for help. The voice was eerily similar, but there was something off about it, a hollow and unnatural tone that sent shivers down their spine. Paralyzed with fear, they stayed still, listening as the voice continued to call out, echoing through the trees. As dawn approached, the voice faded, replaced by the sound of birds chirping and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. Shaken, they quickly packed up and left the forest, vowing never to return. It wasn't until years later that they learned the forest had a dark history. A man had gone missing there decades ago, his body never found. Some hikers reported hearing his voice long after his disappearance, calling out for help in the dead of night. Whether it was the man's spirit or something else entirely, /haunted_hiker never went back to find out. 2. The Old Woman in the Window. Reddit user /ghostlyglance recounts a disturbing experience from their childhood that has left a permanent scar on their psyche. They grew up in a small, close-knit town where everyone knew each other, and the community thrived on shared stories and local legends. Across the street from their house stood an abandoned house, a place that had long since fallen into disrepair. The house had a tragic past. A fire had claimed the lives of the family that once lived there, and the town, out of respect and perhaps fear, left the house untouched. As a child, /ghostlyglance was always warned to stay away from the old house, but like all children, they were curious. One night, unable to sleep, they stared out of their bedroom window, their gaze drawn to the dark silhouette of the house across the street. As they watched, they noticed a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. To their horror, they saw an old woman staring back at them, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark pits that seemed to bore into their soul. Frozen in fear, they watched as the old woman's lips moved, as if whispering something, though no sound reached their ears. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When they finally found the courage to look away and run to their parents, they were met with skepticism. Their parents assured them that the house was empty, and what they saw was just a figment of their imagination. Years later, after they had moved away, /ghostlyglance heard from a childhood friend that the old house was finally being demolished. But before the wrecking crew could finish their work, several workers reported seeing an old woman in the windows, even though the house had been cleared out. Some say it was the spirit of the mother who perished in the fire, forever watching over her lost home. Others believe it was something far more sinister, something that refused to let go of the past.